I was I was jogging the other day, and I went into this one area that it's an area that seems to be in maybe at one time could have been developed. Maybe there may have been homes there, 100 years ago. And there was a lot of fruit trees that were in bloom. Now, these are trees that may have been planted there originally, or they could have just, when the area was cleared, there were seeds deposited. You know how, birds, they fly around, they eat, fruit, and then they swallow the seeds. And many of these seeds don't digest, and they just come out the other end when the bird's flying over. The same is true for foxes, rodents, and so forth. And this spreads seeds around. And so there's a lot of apple trees, cherry trees, and so forth in this area. Now, this gave me a certain epiphany, so to speak. And that is this. You need to have a variety of fruit, vegetables, and so forth in a society. You take a look back at Ireland, and they had a potato blight that killed a lot of the potatoes. Now, the English didn't help, since what potatoes did grow and other foods they shipped out of Ireland to feed their troops and so forth that were spread around the empire at that time. So millions of Irish people starved to death during that time period. Now, that showed that if your reliance is on one particular product and it dies out, or it, for some reason, doesn't produce that season, or for several seasons, then that's actually quite dangerous. And we're starting to get to that point now. That's right. We are getting to that point now. And there's a reason for that. The thing that agribusiness looks at, and yes, farming used to be something that you had small farmers, hobby farmers, medium-sized farmers, and big farmers. But agribusiness has come in the last couple of decades, and they have bought up vast tracts of land and produce, they've gone into the idea of a single crop, or in the sense of factory farms when it comes to animals, a single animal. But I'm going to deal with crops right now. And they'll grow what seems to be like the biggest apples or the largest cherries, that sort of thing. And many of these are engineered. They are genetically modified, and the problem is that those that produce the most per acre wind up being the ones that dominate everywhere. All right. Now, it used to be that there were, if you go back to colonial times, I'm going to come back to this in just a moment here in reference to the colonial times. I heard somewhere where there's 200 different varieties of apples that you could buy at markets. Now, you might not be able to buy those at a market, let's say in Virginia, if the apples were being grown in Massachusetts. Okay, so there was this variety that existed, and there'd be certain differences in taste, texture, and so forth. And, like I said, coming back to this, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, commissioned that people go out all over the world and bring back seeds from all kinds of crops, fruit trees, wheat, barley, so forth. And the idea was that you wanted to have a very successful and diversified farming industry. And so in those days, you may have had, like, for instance, natural apple might have been smaller. It might have been tastier, but, nowadays that's not what sells. Little tiny apples or something like that. And so what's happened as you've had the concentration of farming into conglomerates and corporations and so forth, the number of farmers has been sliced to a fraction of what it was in, let's say, 1990. And therefore, you get this idea of, we will plant a kind of uniform species of highly profitable food. Now, here's where the problem comes in. First of all, you're going to have a vulnerability when it comes to your crops when you do this. The vulnerability will be that what if a disease comes along? Okay, what if some disease comes along and wipes out this particular strain of apple or cherry or pear or peach or plum or whatever? Okay, what happens? Well, you might have a situation where now you're going to have vast shortages. All right? You need to have more of this diversity in order to protect from the idea of concentrating just on one particular variety of fruit. The second problem you have is that if these are genetically modified, what then enables, what is actually the health consequences of that? Now, I'm not going to go into this in much detail here. That's a whole different show. But we're really not certain what the health consequences are. But even beyond that, are these trees that if you plant them will grow and produce trees that will be identical? I've heard there are many seeds that if you plant them, they won't. So farmers have to buy them from the manufacturer when they want to grow next year's crops or next generation's trees. And I would say that is probably a major vulnerability right there. And so the other problem in this is that another thing is that you're concentrating the production of seeds in several large agribusinesses. And these are transnational corporations. They are producing and own the patent to certain varieties of seeds. My understanding is you produce an apple tree that you've made changes in its DNA. You can take a patent on that. And then if later, even if you do grow that apple tree, you're in violation of a copyright because you're growing it without permission. You have not bought that tree, even though you may have grown it yourself. And again, that puts a lot of power within corporations when they can say, well, we own your food. And you say, well, I'll just grow it. And then they can say, well, we own that even if you grow it. You're in violation of copyright. In the same way as, I'll produce music. Well, you've just taken a song and you just had a band or orchestra or whatever play the song. Well, if it's a copyrighted song, it doesn't matter who played it. It's still a violation of copyright. So that occurs when it comes to seeds and stuff as well. So what is one solution that sounds kind of hippie-ish maybe, but what is a solution to this? Well, think about this. If you've got trees growing on your property that, let's say you have an apple tree or cherry tree or plum tree, some sort of fruit tree that has been, that is, let's say 20 years old, 25 years old, 30 years old. In all likelihood, it is not patented in any way. In all likelihood, this comes from pure seed. I might note, I've noted this on other shows, that the Bible translation of pure, when it deals with Noah, deals with a purity of genetics, essentially. And, may shed light on what was going on back in his day than we care to think about, or at least what, controlled churches today teach. But anyway, the idea that you've got maybe trees growing, or maybe there's trees in your neighborhood or just out in the woods that you might go to and harvest fruit that are maybe a variety that's not sold in the stores anymore, or is not patented by someone, gives a certain amount of freedom that people should exercise. And just like Thomas Jefferson, when he sent people out to gather seeds from around the world, well, then they were planted, obviously. Maybe this is something that people should strive to do. If, it sounds weird in a sense. It sounds very hippie-ish, but again, it makes sense. And that is, take the seeds that, let's say you have a cherry tree. And, you take the seeds out in order to make pie, or, you just go out there and pick some cherries and eat them. Well, it leaves the seeds. Save those seeds. Find areas that, just like the parable of Jesus when he used throwing the seeds out, and some of them land on good soil, some on bad, some on rocks, and, some will grow, some won't, in reference to making converts to Christianity. The thing is that if you just scatter those seeds in areas that are vacant, areas where maybe there's it's just land that's just not used. Could be areas that maybe a forest fire or whatever. Just vacant areas. Maybe that is an area that you could just throw these seeds and see if they'll grow. You might throw out 100 seeds, let's say. Maybe one of them will actually produce a tree. But this will help preserve the genetic diversity of, and maybe even, maybe prevent variety from going extinct. Because I'll bet you anything that many people have trees growing on their property, or they have access to, that grow varieties of fruit that may no longer really exist out there in the world today. Maybe those could be some of the surviving trees. Or maybe it's a fraction of what's left of that variety of tree. Why not preserve it? Do we really want a world in which there's 4 or 5 different types of apples and they're all genetically modified? Do we really want a world that, plums are the same way and so forth? Do we really want that? If we don't, then we should strive to try to diversify. Also means on our own property. Maybe we should get past this idea that, good suburban lifestyle, if you've got land, if you've got a yard, has to be one of a flat yard that you just mow all the time. Plant some trees there. And if you can, get trees that are not modified. And you can still go to people that sell trees, the plant shops and so forth, especially in more rural areas. You can get trees that are not GMO. And, maybe plant more trees on our land. If you think about it, what would happen if you had one of those situations where society falls apart? Okay? And what about all of those varieties of apples and cherries and so forth that people grow on these agri-farms? What if those agri-farms aren't able to be maintained in the event of some sort of collapse? A lot of these agri-farms are located in areas like California where if you don't water them continuously through irrigation that comes ultimately from the mountains, if suddenly society collapsed, all of that land will revert back to desert in no time. All those trees will die. I've seen some areas, I saw a documentary one time where they were showing some of the areas that used to have communities in the foothills around Los Angeles. And when the water got diverted away from those areas, then those communities died out. And, there was yards that had trees, but the trees were dead. There was no water. So those vast areas where we are concentrating our food production, if the infrastructure fell apart, which could happen through a pandemic, diseases, you can't predict a disease coming along, similar to the Spanish flu epidemic, which would destroy our infrastructure. You could have some sort of activity of the sun, which could knock out our electrical grid. These are not even war scenarios. War, of course, could do a lot of damage, but I'm just talking about things that could happen regardless of war. And if the infrastructure collapses, that means it's not like in the Great Depression, where there were still vast areas of land that were used for farming and you could still get really low cost produce. Many of those areas now have housing developments on them. Many of those areas now are just gone, or they've been converted to agribusiness, but they don't grow things. I remember where I grew up, there used to be walnut groves everywhere. Okay? As a teenager, I don't like walnuts personally, but, my family did. And I would go out on my bike and just gather up, and no one cared, just gather up bags of walnuts and bring home. And those walnut trees and groves and stuff like that, which were for the most part abandoned, they're gone now. They've been cut down and there's housing developments there now. So imagine if you had a breakdown of infrastructure. Those won't exist. What maybe people could have eaten. I don't know how old those trees were. Maybe they were from the Depression era. Maybe people did eat those, walnuts when there wasn't much to eat back in those days. But they're gone. And the same with, there was peach groves that, my parents would go to, and you could pay a little bit of money and you go in and get really low cost peaches, of which my mom would, can those away, during for the winter. And those are gone. They're gone. There's housing developments there. And so we've concentrated a great deal of our agricultural, we could call infrastructure, in areas that do not sustain life of those kinds of trees unless you artificially bring in irrigation. And an infrastructure collapse would mean that would end. So goodbye, vast areas of the, valleys that exist in California where, that's where we get a lot of our food. So it's a good idea to have variety out there to where we can access it and then be able to survive in the event of a catastrophe. So we're not even just talking about the survival of varieties of fruit and, ultimately other types of crops as well. But we're talking about the survival of human beings. Okay? But too much emphasis on what sells at the store, even, and then suddenly the infrastructure collapses. Well, those kinds of varieties don't exist anymore. And you won't have stores if the infrastructure collapses anyway, either. So, try this. And maybe even if you have seedlings that are growing on your land, just don't mow them down. Teach the kids something, or the grandkids. Dig them up, dig them up when they're small, and then take the kids out and show them how to plant food. These are skills that people had during the Depression. Okay? I remember my dad told me that, he came from a family of 8 kids, and his parents had chickens, for instance, and they would send the kids out to gather bugs to feed the chickens because they could not afford to buy grain to feed the chickens. So the kids would be just going out, and they probably had a great deal of fun doing this. Much more fun than sitting around playing on video games. And you grab grasshoppers and whatever, and put them in a bag, and then bring them home and feed the chickens. That's this sounds like, oh my gosh, what kind of skill is that? I mean, I saw a video that showed kids in I think it was Venezuela, out in the remote areas of Venezuela. And they would go out and find these giant bird spiders, and they would take them and catch them, and then they knew how to prepare them and roast them for food. Now, this wasn't that they were starving; it was just that they felt that eating these spiders tasted pretty good. I've heard they taste like peanuts, but I've never eaten spider before. I've eaten scorpion; they taste like potato chips, but the point is not to sell you on the idea of eating spiders, but the point is we don't have those skills anymore. We seriously don't have those skills. And if, we need to kind of get back on those things. So teach your kids how to plant things. Teach them lessons. Heck, you could teach them a Bible lesson with the seeds, but teach them what's required for growing materials, because we never know when we might need to go back to those days where you needed to produce food yourself. And you didn't have a grocery store that was open 24 hours. You could just go get what you wanted. These are skills that people need to learn. And if they don't, it could mean the difference between surviving and not surviving. So, do it for yourself. Do it for the diversity of nature. Do it for your kids. Do it for the future. But, start cultivating and spreading these kinds of plants out there so that we do have an ability to be able to have a much more secure future, and one in which we're not completely dependent on giant agricultural industries in order to survive. Anyway, that's all the time we have. So take care, and hope to see you back next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.